What is poverty? If you look at these structures, I'm sure they are a physical expression of poverty in the city. And this is exactly what we use to spot poverty from space. We need to have some certain expression by the built environment. If you look at these images, you know from Google Earth and so on that we nowadays can monitor the world in high-resolution satellite data. And while we are flying towards the megacity of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, you can have a closer look that we can, of course, capture the ocean or the vegetation, but we can also spot in detail the different settlement structures. If you look in the north here, you see a very structured, planned environment. And in the southern parts, you see a very organic, unstructured landscape or built environment. And this expression we use to spot poverty across the globe. So, first of all, our main approach is to develop algorithms, because what you see here, what you see in Google Earth, are only images. If I ask anybody in this room, how many buildings do you see here? I'm sure nobody can guess it, but somebody can guess if you want to. It's a very small area. It should be easy, shouldn't it? Actually, it's not. And we classify those. Hopefully, we do. Yes, we classify those areas. We extract reliable geo-information, because what we think is information is not information, it's just data. So we extract the number of buildings, for example, and their footprints and so on. And because we know from a lot of urban geographers there are some hypotheses on the different structural types, we can do some assumptions on the built morphologies. What you see here, yes, you see the planned environment and you see the unplanned organic environment. So putting some information into our algorithms, we can do some assumptions on the building sizes, which are smaller probably, the building heights, which are lower, or some information on density or on the spatial pattern, which is very complex. If we integrate that into our algorithms, we can obviously spot those complex environments within the city, as you can see here. So yes, we are classifying, or we try to classify urban poverty using the term Christian Wertmann doesn't like using, slums, or those assumptions towards slums. So we do morphologic conceptualization to put it into our algorithms. But what I just said, are we really spotting poverty? We did a test here in the megacity of Rio de Janeiro. So we classified the entire city, what you can see here, in basically two different classes of the built environment. You see in gray the formal planned structures of the city, and in red all the areas considered as morphologic slums. And now we have access also to census information, for example, to income of households. And if we just, relate that to each other, we see that in the morphologic slum areas, we have a median income of about 670 Brazilian reais. Compared to the formal structures of the cities, this is a lot higher. It's almost 3 times as large, the income of a household. And if we put in, again, or if we put in the poverty line, you can see that in those areas spotted from space, conceptualized as morphological slums, almost 70% of the people living there are below the poverty line. So, yes, to a certain degree, we can obviously localize a social group. So, using this information, we can classify, obviously, slum structures or informal structures, however you want to call it, in areas. Here's a different example, the megacity Mumbai in India. Okay, we are talking about environmental risks. Just a short detour how we approach this issue. We have a lot of different satellite data available. For example, we have digital surface models. And you know that in a lot of more or less qualitative descriptive studies, it is stated that those areas of urban poverty are basically at high risk, like is one of the topics here. So we did a simple analysis just analyzing where is the exposure to landslides possibly high, just classifying, for example, areas across the city with slopes steeper than 10 degrees. And if we combine that with the classification of formal and non-formal environments, you can see, yes, almost 2% of the informal environments are located in those highly exposed areas and only 0.25% of the formal environment. And we did that for a lot of cities across the globe, in Cairo, in Manila, and so on. And we spot this pattern across the globe. So yes, basically, this assumption is true. So this is what we do on the one side to classify urban poverty. But this is actually not what I came for, to show you this. Actually, I'm here to learn from all of you, because taking this as urban poverty is definitely a way too narrow perspective. This is how we spot poverty from space, but we know there are many different structures which relate to poverty. So I called it widening poverty classifications. Up to now, we use these morphologic structures of slums, high density, organic, complex environment, and so on. But these areas, titled slum, titled informal settlement, titled whatever you want to call them, they are also called in different areas of the globe by local names, like favela in Brazil, or township in Cape Town, in South Africa, and Cape Town actually, and Gecekondu in Turkey. So they all have something in common, what we use to spot that from space, a certain settlement structure. And you see, if we just relate to one parameter, the incredible high building density. You see what you've just seen, the 3D city model of Dharavi in Mumbai has a building density of more than 70%. Just to give you an idea, at least if you're from Germany. If you're in Germany, you feel inner cities in Germany are dense and they have a building density of about 35–40%. Here it's more than 70%. So this is a different dimension of density. And we find that not just in the city of Mumbai, we find that actually all across Asia. We find that in the hutongs of Beijing, in the Gecekondu of Istanbul, or in the slums of Dhaka and Manila, and so on. So this structural type is obviously to a certain degree characteristic. And we find those structures also in Africa. I brought you one example which is probably very famous. This is the floating slums of Lagos in Nigeria. We did a classification of it, and you see that it's part of it is built into the lagoon with similar density. And we find that obviously also in Cape Town, in Nairobi, and so on. And we find those structures also in America. Here is a very famous example from Caracas in Venezuela. You see next to each other the high dense organic settlement structures versus the planned ones. If you look at the classification, here a movie is supposed to come. Yes, you can see that this entire hill or mountain is basically just consisting of buildings. The density is incredibly high. So the same characteristic is true in America, and we find that in Mexico City and in Sao Paulo, and so on. Now, some of you might be surprised that we find those structures also in Europe, actually. A few examples. This is a Roma settlement in Bulgaria with the same densities and the same complex structures. So, or we have more examples. These are slum pockets, called slum pockets in Lisboa in Portugal. You see, it's beneath a commercial area and a residential area. In between is these little pockets of this certain morphologic type. So we find that here or in Greece or in Italy and so on. Okay, this is how we spot poverty from space until today. But we know that this is not enough, because poverty is more widely distributed across the city. And I called it Detecting the Arrival City. I'm not sure if you know the book from Doug Saunders, which was a very inspiring book, I think. And he defined the arrival city not just by these morphologic structures, but he said the arrival city has the function to provide cheap living space to be close to urban functions. And this means closeness or proximity to jobs, to education, to culture, and so on. And that's what is the concept of the arrival city. And this obviously is not just done by slums. And as it has been criticized already, this measuring of urban poverty by the proxy of slums is very conservative. We have to extend that. And we are sure that we know there are many more structures across the globe which stand or represent poverty. I brought you a few examples. If we look to Asia, this is, although it almost looks like a slum, it's not a slum. It's the city of the dead in downtown Manila. The people living there transformed the graveyards into living areas to be close to the functions of the city. Or some other examples. If you have a close look here, what you see are the outskirts of Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. Actually, Mongolia is a very rural country, but still migration into the city is happening there too. And if you have a close look, you see everywhere those little tents. It's the way the rural population lives, and they cannot afford the city life. But still they migrate and they rent a little space in front yards or in gardens to get access to these urban functions. So this structure is also a representation of poverty, but it's not as characteristic as the slums as we measured them. Or nobody would assume this is a slum, but this is a very planned township in South Africa, planned for the urban poor by the government. So a very structured and a very low-dense area in comparison. Or some other examples. These are temporary settlements, refugee camps. We all think that they disappear again, but they are not disappearing. They are growing into cities, so they are part of urban poverty, actually. And in America, the biggest one or the most prominent example of an arrival city is Los Angeles, where you see a lot of Hispanics densifying the typical urban chessboard pattern. And in Europe, the most prominent examples of arrival cities are probably the banlieues of Paris, or in Germany it's Kreuzberg, which has been an arrival city, is now transforming actually. But those structures are very different. So it's not so easy to spot them from space, because a lot of structures inhabit urban poverty and a lot do not. So we need actually this is actually the last example I forgot to show. This is an example south of Madrid. And you see that people settle along a very strange area. And it's because it's an area where ownership was very unclear, because it was a sheep run a few years ago. And people took the advantage to build their living spaces, again, to get access to the city. All right, in the last part, we did a categorization of what we found. So it's not just the arrival cities or the morphologic slums we found. Of course, we did that. We found those typical slum structures as you see here. And I'm not going into the method, but we did a classification using different parameters, characterizing the pattern of those buildings by those areas by density, orientation, by the structural variability. And we characterize also the objects itself, so the buildings, by parameters like the size of the buildings and the heights of the buildings. After this classification, we did a classification of a lot of arrival cities across the globe, just to get an impression which categories may stand for urban poverty. And you see that we've done that for different continents. And if we do so, we find, yes, of course, a large part of it are morphologic slums. Here's another example, Kibera in Nairobi in Kenya, for example. This is what we expect. But we found a lot of other structures, like, for example, deprived neighborhoods. Areas which have been better areas in downtown areas, like, for example, in Cairo, and are now deprived because of a transformation of this area. Or we find almost formal, structured neighborhoods, like, for example, in northern Philadelphia, a very poor area, actually, in a very structured manner, built in a very structured manner. So there are different structural types standing for urban poverty, and I'm very sure that there's enough knowledge here to extend this, because we only have a very small part of it, or a very small perspective on it, and I'm sure you know which structures may stand for that as well. We also find a lot of slum-like structures, hybrid neighborhoods, or formal structured neighborhoods, and so on. And this is what we call, at the German Aerospace Center, Big Earth data. We want to put together data sources from remote sensing, which are growing immensely, but also from any other geodata we do have, to get to the topic of this, or one of the topics of this conference, like it was said in the World Migration Report 2015. Although we have a time where we have incredible amount of data and information ready, we still have a big lack of basic data about this urban poverty. Thank you very much for your attention, and if there are some questions, I'm ready.